this going to come on? Morning. It's your MyID. You can just log in with your MyID. There's two of them that you can log into. One is the Pause Secure.
Oh, okay.
The other is EDU Roam.
Okay.
They both work.
Both of them use your UGA ID.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. So Pause Secure and UGA.
EDU Roam.
EDU.
Yep, and EDU Roam works across many educational institutions. So if you're going to visit someplace else.
Okay, cool. Like if you want to use the library in a different school.
Yeah, if you're at Emory or Augusta or Alaska, wherever.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's why that one exists.
Is it just a Georgia thing?
Nope. No, it literally, I've used it at Alaska. So it's not everywhere, but it's pretty common. So they're trying to make it so that if you have academic credentials, you can log in. All right. So first thing is, have I failed to do anything, put anything on ELC? I think all the slides are there now for the whole semester. And I can either put revised ones up or just replace. Might be easier if I put up revised ones, then you'll see them. And again, it's usually not more than a handful of slides. All the assignments should be up. I don't know if all the readings are, so Ralph emailed me last night because I'd apparently failed to get one of the readings in. So if there's some other reading that I've missed, let me know, and I'll try and get them all on there. As far as I know, they're there. But, all right. If you're okay, I think we're just gonna go ahead and get started. Just gonna double check that these are all on and going. That one is going. That one is going. All right. I think we are ready. All right, we're ready? Okay, so I'm gonna give us our time marker, if that's all right. Awesome, sweet. Okay, so today what we're gonna do is talk about climate change. Okay, and a lot of these slides came from a presentation from a person at the CDC who came and gave a talk, actually not even in my section, in Dr. Nair's section, and then I've embellished with other slides that I added in there. Okay, so this is a slide that I've started with as my first one. It's a New York, out of the New York Times, telling us that 2014 was the hottest year ever on record. And so it's one of those where you go, oh, okay, it's pretty hot. And the thing that was striking to me about this article is that it has in there this little passage, right? So February of 1985 was the last time there was a month that was below the average for the 20th century. Okay, were any of you alive in 1985? Okay, so, right, you have never in your lives, right, most of you experienced a month that's as cold as the average of the 20th century. Okay, and 1976 was the last time we had a year that was colder than the average. Anybody a 76er or before? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to tell you that I remember both of those years, okay? 1976, we had a blizzard, knocked out electricity for 5 days at my house. So I lived on a farm. My mom was we were bringing in the lambs into the basement of the house because it was really cold. And by the end of 5 days, my mom was ready to take us into town to get a hotel room. My mother is tough as nails. Okay, so this sticks in my memory of she was ready to give up. Okay, so really cold. Okay, 1985 I remember because I worked about 20 miles from where I lived, and it was so cold that I couldn't get my car started. I was driving a hand-me-down truck, and it was so cold for like 3 days in a row, I couldn't get my truck to start. And I remember calling my boss. I'm like, Kenny, I'm sorry, I can't make it in. I can't get my truck started, and no one's here to jumpstart the truck. And he's like, if it was anybody else, I'd think you were pulling my leg, but you're the kid who works on New Year's Eve, so I believe you, right? So it was really cold, okay?
There was a blizzard in England so bad that the same thing. I remember like the snow was over my head, and my mom had to drive us into the city.
Exactly. And so even with the snowstorms, I'll be curious, the recent snowstorms that came through in April, and, they were canceling proms all over the place in the Midwest, right? I'll be curious to see that month might be another one that's close to that. Okay, so I haven't seen the official reports on that because it's not long enough ago in the past, but I'll be curious, right? And so the thing is, right, then the next year it's the same report, the same thing, right? 2015. Hottest year ever. 2016. So every year that I've given this lecture, right, it's the same thing, right? And so 2016, right, it's way up here, right? It's getting hotter. You don't have to be a genius, right? It is not to say occasionally we don't get cold weather bursts. We do. Right? But on average, the trend is obvious. You don't need statistics. It's kind of like, pretty sure I can see what's going on there, right? So, right, as of 2016, 16 of the 17 hottest years on record were just in that time span, all right? So, again, you don't have to be a genius to go, right? So here's 1900, here's 2010, right? So all the above average years are over here. All the below average ones are that away. Okay, so it's not hard to figure, that it is getting warmer. Okay, so again, through 2017, right now, 2017 wasn't as hot as 2016 because it's not an El Nino year, right? But it's still up there, okay? So, again, I don't think I really have to convince you that it's getting warmer. Now, the thing that I'll say is, right, do you know when we started having these global warming, when did people start talking about global warming? Do you have a feel for that? Right, so Al Gore was pushing on it pretty hard in the 90s, and the discussion started in the 80s, right? So if you can imagine, I'm going to go back, right? If we're sitting here, right, that's still debatable. Is it getting warmer? Yeah, it seems like it's getting warmer since then, right? So when people say it's debatable, if they went to college in the 80s, right, or the last time they paid attention to this was the 80s, yes, it totally was debatable at that point in time, right? It's really not. Have you seen these spirographs of temperature? Those are also really striking. So they give you the mean temperature, and then it, shows you on a month-by-month basis going around how it's getting warmer and warmer. And I mean, it's only going outward. It's not really going back in. So again, there's a bunch of graphics out there.
Only the elderly, is it mostly the elderly?
So definitely the elderly is the sensitive population. Yep, and we will for sure we'll talk about one example of that. That's the vulnerable population that we worry the most about extreme temperatures. Okay, and so I just wanted to give you some of the basic slides of what's the background to climate change. So if you need to try and convince a cousin or an uncle or whatever that this is real, it's not just some liberal, conspiracy theory, you can look up the data for yourself and have a conversation with people, right? It's not saying that people are bad if they don't know the information, but it's good to actually look at the information, okay? All right, and so there are some other, websites that are a little more activist, I would say, right? So this is something, again, a website that has a lot of information. It's probably a little over the edge, a good bit of it, but it's pretty clear some of the information that they're giving you, right? The big things that I've given you some of these reports to read, and we're gonna do some writings based on these reports, is what these changes mean for public health, right? And there are lots of things, lots of ways that public health is impacted by global climate change. And you can see these are more than 10 years old now. So it's been a while since the public health community has really accepted that climate change is real and it, has implications for public health that we ought to know and be thinking about and planning for, right? So, I mean, this is one of those sort of slow motion tragedies. You can see it coming, right? You can plan for it, pretty much.
Now, do we know for sure that fossil fuels are the cause?
So I'm going to show you the evidence for that, okay?
So my question to you is, if all of that is true,
yep.
How do we convince our current president that climate change is actually real? Because didn't he say it was like a hoax or something like that?
He doesn't want to know. I think that's why he fired all the.
How can you convince him that salt tastes like salt if he's going to tell you it's pepper? Right? I mean, that's a dude who won't accept reality in his face. And that's a lot of the people who are making this debate are just making stuff up because they want to get to a particular outcome, right? If you're not gonna, if you have a salt shaker in your hand and you shake it out and you taste it and you go, no, it's salt, and somebody tells you it's pepper, I don't know how you deal with that.
They cut all the funding. Who was a climatologist here, a professor here, lost her when Trump took office. They cut her jobs.
Oh yeah.
She lost all funding.
Oh yeah, and I mean, and there are agencies in the federal government where you can't use the words climate change. You know the one agency where you can use climate change? There's one agency that refused to change. Department of Defense. They said, we're going to still do climate change because it's, it's a hazard to our national security. So, EPA, NOAA, all that, if those are, they can do what they need to do, but DOD's like, no, we're not going to take that bullshit, right? So what I'm going to try and do is show you the evidence so that anyone who is rational and willing to hear actual evidence, you have the opportunity to present it to them, right? There are some people who are not going to change, right? And my recommendation to you is to be polite and not waste your time. Okay, sorry. So what's some of the evidence, right, again, that you should be able to show people? One is the whole temperature thing, right? And they'll say, oh, but I made a snowball, right? It's obvious. Oh my God, it snowed in Washington, D.C. There's no way there can be, right? So So those things are true, right? So, but the thing is, right, so temperature is one thing, sea level for sure is going up, and snow cover is going down, right? So those are sort of objective data measures that you can in fact show to people, right? And it's not that any particular day or week or maybe even a month isn't going to be up or down, right? Our climate is still variable, the weather is variable, but the trends are clear.
The snow cover, do you mean like glaciers, like permanent snow cover? Or in general?
Both that and the average amount of snow cover that's, on the Earth's surface per year, okay? Other measures that you can look at and sometimes you see are CO2 levels, methane levels, temperature levels, and what I want you to get from this, right, is this is going back 400,000 years. How do we know CO2 levels from 400 to 1,000 years ago? We didn't have instruments. There weren't people. There weren't modern humans have only been here 50,000 years. So carbon dating is something that people use to estimate the age of certain things. But do you know where where you would find these? And then temperature is correlated. So temperature you can't measure directly. There aren't direct measures. Temperature is indirect, but you can measure these directly. And the way they get them is from ice cores. So if you go to Antarctica or Greenland, right, and you drill down into the ice, you can measure, right, because it's going to lay down year by year new snow every year, new precipitation. And so if you go down in depth, you can measure very, very accurately what's inside those ice cores, and you can get, direct measures of methane, CO2. You can also get things like pollen. You can get pollution, things that are in the air, dust that's in the air. If there's smoke, if there's a volcano, you can see evidence for all those things directly from an ice core. Okay, and those go back for hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, and there's a pretty fair amount of research that's gone into that because it tells you what's been going on for as long as that ice has been accumulating. Okay, and we realize we're losing ice, so if we want to get the information, we need to do it now, right? All right, there's a really nice timeline of Earth's average temperature, right, which goes for the last 20,000 years. So since it's been clear that, humans have been around, and it starts with things like, ice that's a mile thick over New York City and Boston, right? So it's at the time of the last glacial maxima. So there's ice covering much of North America at that point. And if you scroll down and scroll down and scroll down, it comes, eventually you get back from the 18 or 1500s through modern day, right? And you can see Shakespeare, Newton, United States independence, telegraphs, right? And there's this huge bend in the curve. Okay, and so it's relatively impressive if you look at that. And again, it's, it's kind of a cartoonish, kind of fun thing to look through. And it shows the little ice age and some stuff like that, right? And so you can see, though, that most of recorded human history, our climate has been very stable, okay? And sort of unusually stable, which is part of why humans have been able to sort of move around the globe and be successful, is that we've, we've had minimal differences in the climate that we've had to fight, okay? Again, so this is temperature, and these are temperatures based on instruments, right? So scientific instruments, and you can see it only goes back to around 1800, because we didn't have very good instruments prior to that. And even if we had some good ones, they weren't spread around the globe in any meaningful way, okay? And so what you'll see is that, if you look over the past 50 years or so, those are pretty tight lines, and then you get more and more variance because there were fewer instruments and they were, less accurate than what we have today. Okay, and mostly there were fewer instruments, right? They covered less of the Earth's surface. Okay, if you look at Arctic sea ice, again, Arctic sea ice has been declining. And this is one where a graph sort of doesn't do it justice. I think it's a lot more clear to look at the maps. And so this is looking down, right, onto Greenland. This is the North Pole is sitting up here, right? And so this is 2007, how much ice there was at the minimum. So the middle of summer or the end of summer when there's as little ice as possible. But that red line is how much ice there was in 1979. Okay, so, right, this is one of those where it's the climate change deniers are mostly, my age and older, so 50 plus. Right? Why is it that no one could find a Northwest Sea Passage? Because it was blocked by ice. No longer true, right? So if you look in 2012, it's even smaller, right? I mean, you can literally now go from Europe to China up over the top.
Was it different before 1979?
It was even bigger.
Was it?
Yep. But it wasn't sort of dramatically bigger, but it was bigger. Okay? And so, again, this sort of showing where it was. And 79 is when they, got good satellites, so they could really map it very accurately. Ahead of that, you had reports from people in various places, but you really couldn't map it in a really good way. Okay, so that's why they use 79 as their baseline. But again, right, you can see you can take your ships up over the top, which again, we couldn't do, okay? And if you, again, look at sort of how thick it is and where it is, this is Greenland again, there's a large amount that you can go through where you don't need an icebreaker, okay? And so this sort of shows how much it's receded over the decades, right? So if you take 79 is equal to 80, it was a good bit bigger only a decade before that. And you can see where it's going, right? It's gonna get smaller and smaller. It's, and this is sort of with models that are not at the extreme, right? It could get worse than this. It may not be quite as bad, but this is sort of an average of the conservative models. Okay.
So in 2100, the ink, that's
Yep.
the estimated amount of glacier.
Arctic sea ice, at the minimum in the, at the end of the summer, how much sea ice will be left. And essentially there's, none. By the end of this century, and really by the middle of this century, it's going to be an insignificant amount of sea ice left at the end of summer. Okay, so that's what you're going to see this in your lifetimes, right? And that's why people are worried about polar bears, right? Because polar bears need ice to be able to hunt. Not going to have it. Okay? What does this mean, right? So again, I'm giving you some URLs to NASA websites on climate. It's a lot of information, maybe a little more obscure this year than it was 2 years ago. Because the EPA's websites were all rearranged. You can still get to archives of it. But the big thing is, right, so most scientists, right, it's very difficult to get to 100% of all of anybody, right? So do you remember the Bigfoot believers? Okay. How likely is it if you have 1,000 scientists that none of them believe in Bigfoot? Right? There's a few Bigfoot believers in any large group of people, okay? So, getting to 100% consensus is really difficult, right? getting to even getting to 90+% consensus is really difficult. Well, that probably means the 90% plus are right. Okay, occasionally, like we showed with H. pylori, they're not. Right? It's possible the 3% are right, but mostly the 3% are people who are refusing to. They're the Sheldons of the world. Is that meaningful to you? You know what I mean, right? With Big Bang Theory, a Sheldon's not going to admit, right? No, there's still the possibility that this could be real, right? Or this may not be the case, okay? So again, this is one of those, this is again, sort of an activist website. I think it goes a little too far, and this illustrates a way in which you could say, oh, that sort of makes sense, right? Is that you have 14,000 almost peer-reviewed climate change articles, and only 24 of them reject. Okay? Now, the thing is, what that fails to tell you is how many were ambiguous, right? How many fail to reject in the other way, that there is change. Okay, that number would be quite different. Okay? So it's one of those things where you can, both sides of any argument, you can sort of go a little too far. So I just want to make that clear. Okay. You were asking what amount of the CO2 or what amount of the climate change is due to human activities. Okay, and so again, I would say in the 80s, whether there was climate change or not was debatable. In the 90s, it was, by the mid-90s, it's pretty clear there was climate change was real, but the question was how much of it is caused by humans, right? And so this sort of answers that. Once we got to sort of the mid-2000s, and certainly within the past 8 or 10 years, that answer has been really consistent, is that sort of, 80-ish or 90-ish% of climate change is due to human activities, right? So if you have a good computer model, they almost all ascribe the vast majority of the change to human activities. And what's also true is that a large percent, if this is right, this is human, they're all in one direction. The natural things are sort of up and down, but most of them are in the opposite direction. So natural processes are pointing towards cooling. Okay? So that's how you can get actually even more than 100% of the warming is from human activities. Okay? So, again, I'm not going to, I don't want to argue about is it 70% human, is it 95% human, or is it, more than that? But it's pretty clear any large fraction of studies you look at are going to point to a large percentage of the studies being human-induced, right? And again, so now if you ask people what's their perception of climate change, and many people who believe that, again, it's debatable, right, think that scientists are split, right? And why do they believe that? Because if you look on TV, they have one expert that's for it and one expert that's against it. That must mean it's still about a 50-50 split, right? And again, if you go back several decades, that was more or less true. But, it's harder and harder to find somebody who's going to defend, that there's not climate change now. You can still find people who will do it. They're on TV all the time as the rare person who's willing to defend climate change as not real. Okay, and again, I don't want to say that this is the best website for information. I just want to say, right, it's hard to find any group of people, especially very skeptical scientists, who are all going to agree on anything. Okay. If we have time, this is, I thought that was a pretty funny clip actually, but it's really telling of the story of, who's denying what and what their motivations are. And this is a few years removed from current controversy, but you'll see it's still the same stuff playing out. All right, so let me ask you this. Are you aware of the last presidential candidate who ran on climate change as being a really big deal? So Al Gore did, and then after Al Gore, there was another presidential candidate. So Hillary did, and in between them, there was a Republican. John McCain. One of his things, he was all about climate change is real, it's a threat to our national security, right? He's a DOD guy. It's a threat to our military, it's a threat to our nation's security, we're going to deal with it. So in the course of 8 years, we've gone from super strong Republican support for dealing with climate change to not, okay, which I find relatively bizarre. Anyway, so other things, right, is that glaciers, right? So if you have ever visited glaciers in the past, they're almost certainly much smaller now than the last time you were there. What are the things that start hitting public health, right? One of the big things is there's more extreme weather, right? So it's not the average that's such a big deal, it's the occurrence of more extreme events. And they'll be both more extreme in the super hot and extreme in the super cold, right? So getting these April, blizzards is, and I have one on my phone I probably should bring up, right? So I should incorporate a little movie, right? One of my sisters sent me, the April blizzard, it's just wind blowing like crazy from the first week of April. It's like, are you kidding me? That's nuts. So at any rate, you're going to see more precipitation, more cyclones, more droughts, and sea level increases, right? All of those are coming at us, right? And so again, this just sort of shows graphically, right? The average is going to move some, and that's what we've mostly been talking about so far, but it's those extreme events, whether it's temperature or precipitation, that really affects people's lives. Right, and to illustrate that, and the fact that old people are, the population, the elderly is the population that we worry a lot about, is that here's, average temperatures in the summer in Europe for a long time, and they had this huge heat wave come through in 2003, right, and it killed literally tens of thousands of elderly.
20
Yep.
years ago, and this wave of the elderly had died in Scotland.
Yep.
And temperatures, I don't think they've gotten that high comparatively, maybe 90 degrees.
Yep.
87
but
or something, but
there's no air conditioning. Exactly. That's right. And that was exactly the deal, is that the places where they took the elderly to where there was air conditioning, right, there was reduced effect, right? But the elderly who stayed in place had real problems. All right, so built environments, right? So the environments that we build are also not great for climate change, right? So we have these heat islands, which I'll talk about in a minute or two. And it's also true that a lot of the places where people have moved are, poor shanty towns, right? So there's very poor infrastructure to be able to support big rain events, to be resilient against big rain events and extreme temperature events. Okay, this is just a slide to show the proportion of people who are over 60 is going to increase over time. Right, so we're getting better at saving people and letting them live longer, which in general is good, but it does create an issue in that you're going to have more of this sensitive population to deal with. This is the slide I was talking about for heat islands, and I mean, it can be significant, right? 5 or 10 degrees warmer around an urban center where you have especially a lot of asphalt and concrete, right, that's absorbing those sun's rays and re-emitting it as heat. Okay, The other thing we'll talk about is that heat, summer heat, and is associated with air pollutants, in particular ozone, and other contaminants that come from driving cars. So we'll talk about that more when we talk about air pollution. But again, this is one of those, maximum daily ozone amount, and you can see that when you get into the summer, that's when you start getting really high amounts of ozone. And ozone, the bottom line about ozone is it's the one air pollutant we're really not controlling. Almost everything else we're doing a pretty good job with, but ozone is really problematic. And part of it is, you're fighting those temperatures, right? It's more of a problem as it gets hotter, and as the climate gets hotter, that's a bigger problem to try and deal with.
Does it cause lung disease and such?
It's a reactive molecule, so so the way that I've had it described to me is it's sort of like a sunburn on your lungs. Okay, so and it's not that you're not going to die from a sunburn, but if you have a repeated exposure to it, then you can get melanoma, right? So that's kind of the idea. So it's bad. Pollen, right? So especially species that produce a lot of pollen. I don't know if it was just on the news like a day or two ago. Some story about the pollen season is so much longer, and especially for species like ragweed and some of the trees that produce, huge amounts of pollen for an extended period of time, right? So it's not your imagination that pollen is worse than it used to be. Again, this is the idea of you're going to get a lot more rain. Why are you going to get a lot more rain? When the oceans warm up, you're going to evaporate water, put it into water vapor that gets, distributed across the land. You make clouds, and that's where the rain comes from. So warming oceans are going to lead to more rain events. Okay, and this is just, again, some illustrations of extreme rain events that have occurred. And, you can imagine if this is your infrastructure, that's not going to be very resilient to a big rain event. Okay, and there's one other thing that I don't think I have on here, but it's been in the news a couple times in the last year or two, generally associated with rain events. So diseases definitely come out with rain events. What else? Mudslides, right? So when you see, these things, right? So if this hillside collapses, right, those people are toast, right? And even in California, right, where we have really good physical infrastructure, if you're in the way of a mudslide, even if your house stays in place, right, the mud moves through your house, right? So I don't know if you saw those stories in the past 6 months or so with the big mudslides in California, right? And they had huge boulders, right? People-sized boulders inside people's living rooms, right? So, I mean, it's really significant. Waterborne disease outbreaks, right? So that gets back to your point, is that, right, most waterborne disease outbreaks are associated with extreme precipitation events. And so, let me ask you that. Why would that be? Why would a big rain cause a waterborne disease outbreak?
It's into the water supply.
Okay, how does it get into the water supply?
It's down the drain.
So what's getting into the water supply that's different from normal? So normally when you flush a toilet, where's the water go? It goes to the water treatment plant, right? The water treatment plant takes care of your poo and all the bad bacteria that are in your poo. Where do you find water treatment plants? What are they next to? What physical, natural feature of the landscape are almost all water treatment plants built next to? Right? So they're right next to a river. So if the river floods, it floods out your water treatment plant, both your source, which is usually upriver, right, and the, where they're dealing with your sewage, the sewage treatment plant. So if you, inundate your sewage treatment plant with flood water, then the next town down is getting raw sewage where they're trying to pump water out. Does that make sense? So, right, so thusly, right, you see oftentimes disease outbreaks associated with flooding events, right? So because you're mobilizing poo in the environment. And even if you don't, mobilize and inundate somebody's water treatment plant, you can imagine that if you have pastures from cattle and pigs and goats, other livestock, right, you're going to wash that physical biosolid into the rivers, and that becomes mobilized. Okay? So if you have disease agents that are carried by cows, things like crypto, that causes scours in calves, you're going to mobilize that out of the feedlot and into the stream nearby, which gets into the river, which gets sent downstream into the next water intake for the next town. Does that make sense? So these are part of the reasons we worry why. And an example of this, it was in Milwaukee in 1993, when hundreds of thousands of people got diarrhea, and the really bad kind of diarrhea, so cryptosporidia, caused about 50 deaths, right, and millions of dollars worth of medical costs and lost productivity, okay? And so crypto is relatively important in public health and environmental health. Do you know where we normally worry about crypto? It's a good guess, but in the United States, so it's true. In Africa, it's a real problem with diarrheal diseases, so that's absolutely true. In the US, where do we worry about crypto? We test for it on a regular basis. Good guess. Where are you exposed to water that other people have potentially pooed in? Swimming pools, right? So the deal about crypto is that it has a hard shell, so that if you get a baby that has diarrhea or anyone who has diarrhea and they get into the pool and they've got crypto on them, chlorine doesn't kill it. Saltwater treatment, saltwater pools also aren't particularly effective at killing crypto. Okay, so it's a very difficult thing to be able to kill. So it's a parasite that persists in public pools. And so the people who go around and test public pools, this is one of the things they're looking for. Okay, waterborne pathogens. Awesome, right? And so have you seen the studies where, I should probably get a graphic where it shows the number of turds per pool, right? Now it gives the distribution of that. There's a really classic TED Talk that shows, how you display information, right? So anyway. Yeah. Right, so at some point I'll dig that up and add that in here. This is really great. Well, not to this one, but to the water one. Maybe if I can find it before I talk about water. So there's direct sort of hydrogeological events. There's also fires are a really big thing, right? And so what's our take-home message about fires in the United States? Do you know there's kind of a big federal fight about fires? Do you know who fights fires on the federal level? Start there. U.S. Forest Service, right, is right? They spend tens of millions of dollars on forest fires. And so what agency is the Forest Service in? Do you know that one? Good guess, super good guess, not true. That's a great guess. It's a crop. Forests are a crop. It's in the ag department, USDA. So the USDA's budget has been, they've been going over budget every year for the past decade or more because they don't have enough money to fight fires. Every year they run out of money to fight fires. Okay, so tropical cyclones, again, we've talked about that. Increasing temperatures are going to be a problem. It's kind of strange to me, actually, that over the past decade, until last year, we had relatively few bad hurricanes. So between Katrina and last year, we had a longer than average break of major hurricanes. But last year, we kind of, had them in spades. Harmful algal blooms, right? So these are these things where you're getting algae that literally turns the water. It looks like pea soup. And have you seen, maybe you've even seen them on your news feeds, the blue fluorescent on the beaches and in the waves in California? Have you seen those? So at night, apparently, there's some of these species that turn blue fluorescence. So it's beautiful. There's some awesome photographs if you go to Instagram and whatever, you know what I mean? Have you seen any of those, or am I just like, no, you never go there? Anyway, so it's so those should be coming across some of your news feeds occasionally. So the thing is, these not only just make the water look either beautiful at night or really crappy during the day, they also release toxins into the water, and they're toxins that are not normally captured during typical water treatment, so they can make it into the water supply. So it forces the water treatment people to do specific things that they normally don't have to do, and it costs more time and money for them to try and deal with it. And if they make a mistake and they don't catch it quick enough, then people can get sick. Another big area that you'll see is vector-borne diseases. Those are changing. The distributions of the vectors are changing. So people oftentimes think mostly about mosquitoes, right, as a common vector. They are super common. They're actually not the most worrisome vector in the United States. But for sure, right, climate change is changing where some of these guys exist, how many months they're around. So that's going to change some of the diseases. All right, and you tell me, so what are some of the vector-borne, mosquito-borne diseases that we've been hearing about in the news? So malaria, and what about some more that are in the United States? And in Brazil? Zika, right? In Puerto Rico, right? So these are mosquito-borne diseases, okay? So dengue, also called break-bone fever, right? Because it hurts so bad that it feels like your bones are broken. That's another thing coming back into the United States, carried with mosquitoes. So, good times, woohoo, right? Right, so this is Zika, right? So this got a lot of media attention. There's folks here at UGA studying Zika. All right, so you tell me, what was the thing that we saw with Zika that was causing such a public health problem? Exactly, so babies were born with microencephaly, right? So their brains were underdeveloped. And I mean dramatically underdeveloped, okay? So many of these babies aren't gonna live real long, and if, maybe months to a few years, and if they do make it beyond that, they're gonna have extreme developmental problems, okay? So it's pretty extraordinary, right? That particular outbreak, and we can talk about that when we talk about other diseases if you want to.
Are there medications that can easily address
It depends on which disease you're talking about and when they get it and what it is. So with Zika, most women actually are asymptomatic. They don't have anything. If they have anything, it's like a mild fever. It's like a super mild case of the flu, right? So it's not a big deal to the women. It's a real problem to the fetus.
So they don't know they have it?
Yeah, or they're like, oh, I got sick, but it wasn't any big deal, right? So it's problematic. And then once the babies have microencephaly, there's no obvious recovery from that. There's no drug you can take to regrow your brain. Right? They've missed the window of when brain growth was going to be normal. All right, so if you look at a lot of diseases in the U.S., there's a few of them that are communicable. The big one that's vector-borne in the United States is Lyme disease. It's becoming more and more prevalent over time. Do you know how Lyme is transmitted? Through ticks, right? Exactly. And so these are confirmed cases. They also have some probable cases. And lately, what the CDC has been estimating is that this is about 10% of what people actually have. So their estimate is that there's like 300,000 cases of Lyme disease per year in the United States. So it's been growing a lot. So that means ticks actually transmit 90 to 95% of the vector-borne diseases in the United States that are reportable. So even though there's a lot more money and panache going into mosquitoes, so I've been trying to do more and more work on ticks, so I have this biased view.
Is
right?
it concentrated in certain states? Because I went to high school in New Jersey and
It is.
heard about it almost
Yep.
every day. We received education.
Yep.
On it. And then here, I hardly ever heard about it.
Exactly. And so I'm going to show you, I think some maps will pop up on the end of this slide, right? So it's an ecological kind of weird thing, is that Borrelia, so the thing that causes the bacteria, spirochete that causes Lyme disease, is in mammals, small mammals, but not deer. Okay, deer are not a competent host, but if you have deer, they make for lots of ticks. Okay, so it's this weird trade-off between these two guys, is that you need to have both mice and deer around to have a lot of Lyme disease in the environment. There's social factors of where you put your houses and whether people are in contact with, ticks that have been exposed to mice.
There's a lot of forests in New Jersey, a lot of
Yep, so that's part of it. And so where Lyme disease has been a problem traditionally is in the Northeast. So up in here, it has not been a problem, even though we have the same species of tick down here. And the thing that's different is that these guys, so the ticks are a 3 life stage. So they emerge from the egg as tiny little nymphs. None of them have Lyme disease at that phase because the mom tick can't transmit to babies through the eggs. Okay, so they all come out disease-free. The first thing that they feed on, typically though, are Paramiscus, other small mammals, and if they are infected, then they become infected at that phase. The next one are nymphs, and so sometimes the little guys, the larval ticks, people will call them seed ticks, and sometimes depending on the species, they'll also call the nymph stage a seed tick, because they're tiny, right? The larval guys are super tiny. The nymphs are, you can see them easily, but they're really still tiny. And then the third stage is the adult, and they tend to feed on the deer. So you need to have the deer around to make lots of babies. But if you have these guys around, then that propagates. And so typically what people worry about is especially the nymph stage. So if a seed, the larval stage bites you, it's not a problem, as you're probably not going to notice before it falls off, actually. But if the next stage up, if they are infected and they're tiny little guys and they bite you, those are the ones you don't notice, right? And those tend to be the ones that give you Lyme disease. Anyway, and so the other place where it's really been spreading is in the upper Midwest. So there's now a huge stage there. And again, if you do climate change modeling, it'll, different parts of the country have different amounts. I actually don't like those maps very much, to be honest. There's some other maps that are way more accurate than that colleagues of mine are working on. In addition to things that you've heard about, there's other things that you may not have heard about. So this is a type of fungus that lives in the forest. And so the people who get sick from this fungus are people who go out and camp. And so what's the portion of the population that is the camping? Who are people who go camping? Okay, so there's Boy Scouts, but it's scientists. It's mostly young, active people who get sick and can die from this particular fungal disease. So it's up in the trees, and it's a spore, so you breathe it in and get it into your lungs. And this is something that came over from Australia, actually is where it came from, as far as we know. And so, it's not, again, it hasn't killed large numbers of people, but there's 100 cases of it in the US as of, I think this is 2 or 3 years old now, and a quarter of them died, right? And these are young, healthy people, right, who are out in the environment. It's not like it's the sick and elderly, okay? And again, this sort of shows what's going on, but it's fungal disease that gets into your lungs. All right, and now do you know sort of biologically why it's hard to treat fungal diseases? Right? Have any of you ever had a fungus? You gotta get it on your foot or whatever, you gotta get rid of it. It takes a long time, right? You gotta take like stuff for weeks on end. Right? You get that under your fingernails or whatever, it's there forever. It feels like forever, right? Right? And so the thing is that biologically, fungal cells are way more similar to your, animal cells than bacteria are, right? So it's harder to find things that will kill a fungus and not kill you. So we have fewer things, and they tend not to work as fast as stuff that, we can hit bacteria with. Okay, so again, this is one of those things. I've worked on fungal stuff, and part of the reason why is I think you're going to have more of these diseases over time. Right? And when they pop up, they're going to be harder to treat. CO2 also does things that you might not think about, like it changes protein concentrations in crops that we're dependent upon for our food, which is not good. It also changes herbicide resistance and herbicide efficacy. Again, that's not good. It's sort of one of these indirect weird things. So, in general, there's lots of things, right, that climate change impacts, and that, leads to a whole host of public health issues that we need to be dealing with. Okay, and so that, if you think back to the study, the 2010 NIEHS paper that I'm having you read, it's in your reading list, it sort of goes through some of these things. And so what I want you to do is to contemplate what some of those things are, and, based on your own interest or your beliefs, what it is that you find interesting, and to sort of dig into one of those things. Does that make sense? And so that's the notion. All right. And now the bad news, right? Sure. So even though there's, we know what the effects are, there's not been a ton of coordinated effort from public health people to really address these issues, right? But we don't have to take on Donald Trump. We don't have to have him be convinced that climate change is real and we should do something about that, right? You can totally park that, leave it to the side, and simply talk about other things that you want, And as a side benefit, you get, we start addressing things that have to do with climate change. Does that make sense? All right, so we're going to talk about some of those things, right? So we're going to promote co-benefits. And so again, this is one of these CDC things, right? So if we reduce emissions, right, by just having people walk, right? So if we say we're going to have a public campaign, be best by walking, walk your children to school, have your children, do that. Increasing physical activity, all right? We're going to decrease air pollution, increase, social capital from people working together, right? So there's all these things that you get simply from promoting greater physical activity and using cars less for very short distance things. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so again, this is what are some of the things that we can do? I'm not going to go through this, and what I'm going to just say is that there's some of these things where I might, on the next evaluative exercise, ask you to give me an example of something. So this is something where you might be able to pull out an example, right? You don't memorize all this stuff, but if there's one thing that's like, oh, that does make sense to me, okay? It also feeds into environmental justice, so we'll have, again, a whole chunk of a lecture that deals with environmental justice in particular, but the preview to that and how climate change is affected there is that people who are the poorest tend to be the ones who A, contribute the least to climate change, but B, suffer the most from it. Okay? So this is the opposite of, having the polluter pay principle, or the user pay principle. This is the non-user pay principle. Okay, and so this is sort of looking at carbon emissions. So you can see Africa is tiny, right? Especially Central Africa, South America, tiny, huge countries, Europe, the US, right? We're the big carbon emitters. But if you look at who it is who's paying, right? That's who suffers from climate change. All right, so it's almost the polar opposite of the last one. All right, so that's the notion of how this is an injustice. All right. Okay, but even inside the United States, right, a country with no shortage of natural resources and ability to help people if we had the political will to do it, you still see these major crises, right, where we had a failure to plan and a failure to respond once things started going to the bad, right?
Well, the weather in those even in the United States, that tornado, Louisiana,
This is all Louisiana. This is New Orleans, right? I mean, you had thousands of people inside the Superdome, right? Which, for short term, okay, but the number of people versus the number of bathrooms, showers, availability of food, right? Right? I mean, it was crazy, okay? So communication is a big thing, right? So ideally, we would like to be able to communicate with others and bring them along to the same place we are, all right? So you can do the whole, the end is near, blah, 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 right? Alarmist sort of thing. So if that works for you, great, but usually that's not the best way to go, right? So accusing people also typically not that helpful. What tends to be more helpful is to, tell people what the outcome is going to be, right? The effects on their health, the effects on their children, right? That you don't have to be a genius to see how things are going, to say if they keep going that way, it's not going to be good, right? So that's real. So there's both things that we can do, sort of direct mitigation things, and things that we can adapt to try and make the climate better, right? And you're going to see we're going to need all hands on deck, right, to try and move this forward. again, you don't have to talk only about polar bears, right? You can talk about asthma rates, kids' health. It's, and the co-benefits of what it takes to try and improve health for, either of those scenarios. Whatever it is gets people motivated to do the right thing, it's all good. Okay? So this is it's a mainstream thing, right? You can frame it as a human welfare, public health issue, right? If you're going into public health, this is in your wheelhouse. The other thing to be, pretty conscious of is the whole idea of opportunity cost, right? So this is yes, it's going to cost us something to take this action, right? But not taking this action is going to cost way more in the future. And I think this does, a pretty good job of sort of illustrating that principle of, oh no, what if we clean up the environment and make the world a better place for our kids? And then we didn't really have to. I still think that's a good thing, right? Right? It's okay. It's not wasted money. Then I have maybe one or two other trivia things at the end here, right? So I told you I'd show you a slide that gave you the size of Greenland. That's really over the top of the United States. So you can see it's, a quarter of the size of the U.S., but the ice is a mile deep. Okay, so that's a big chunk. If that all melts, that will raise the oceans about 20 feet. Okay, so you're not likely to see that melt entirely in your lifetime. There's some probability a large fraction of it could. Okay, if you live a long time and it melts on sort of the faster trajectory, the Antarctic ones are probably the bigger issue, right? So if Antarctica melts, then you're talking about 180 feet of ocean rise. So that's why they're worried about some of the big ice shelves in Antarctica slipping into the ocean, right? So good news. Great, good news. All right, so if you want, I can pull up a couple of these videos and we can watch those if you would like. It's sort of up to you. That sort of demonstrate what's going to go underwater, if we stay on the current trajectory and melt all the glaciers in Greenland and the South Pole. Yeah? You ready for that? All right. So let's do that.
So how concerned should we be about
I can look anywhere. I get emails on my flip phone. Sometimes I work in my truck. I work up there
Is
in the
this?
barn.
Skip the ad. All right, sorry.
how concerned should we be about buying a house on the East Coast for the next 20 years?
Next 20 years, if it's not already someplace that's getting flooded, right? So, in Miami, right? There are places already getting flooded, right? I wouldn't be doing that, right? If you're someplace that's very close to being flooded, 20 years, it just depends on the very specifics of the place you're looking at, right? And so, this isn't going to happen real soon, but there's places like Miami where
sea levels are rising. That's undeniable. Global warming is causing much of the planet's ice to melt and oceans to expand, pushing sea levels higher. In 2014, researchers reported that the West Antarctic glaciers had retreated past the point of no return. The ice melt is now unstoppable. Other research has predicted that the Arctic may experience ice-free summers as soon as 2050. If all of Earth's land ice were to melt, our oceans would rise 216 feet. So what would the United States city could rise twice as fast as other parts of the country within the next 100 years. This is especially troubling considering there are parts of lower Manhattan less than 5 feet above sea level. All in all, rising seas of this magnitude could displace hundreds of millions of U.S. residents, could destroy most of the country's most prosperous cities.
So, awesome news, right? So again, they have one that also does the whole world. So if you're interested in the whole globe, they kind of got that. And this is not likely to occur in your lifetimes, right? This is almost certainly not going to occur in your lifetimes or your grandchildren's lifetimes, okay? The question is, where is it going to be between where it is now and that over the next 200 years, right? So, I mean, it could melt in a couple hundred years. And the way that these melting models go, they don't have a very good idea of the dynamics of the melting because they mostly don't know what's going on underneath the glaciers. I don't know if you've seen any of the videos where they're showing all the water that's going down under the glaciers in Greenland and showing the amount of water flow under there. So the speed at which we can, at which the melting is going to occur and our ability to predict it is pretty poor. Okay, so is it going to happen in 50 years, 500 years? I don't know. Okay, and I don't think many people credibly know. And I think a lot of people 10 years ago would have said it's probably at that 500-year range. I think there's probably a lot more people are like that, maybe 100 or 200 years is when we start seeing really dramatic increases in sea level. Okay, so, right, so if you think you're going to build a castle and leave it to 20 generations, don't build it in Florida, right? That's my bottom line there, right? If you're, if you want to buy a vacation house and have it in Florida and you're going to own it for a decade, sure, whatever you want. You're going to have a hurricane or whatever to deal with, but that's not super unusual. It's just likely to be more frequent than it would have been previously. All right, does that make sense?
It does.
There's also the other video that we could watch if you want to. Into old comedy. Or you can get your lunches. We can take a break and watch it over break. What do you want to do? All right. All right. So let me grab that guy.
The best barbecue comes from those hole-in-the-wall places. You know.
All right. Now you may be thinking, do we really need a march to raise awareness about global climate change? I mean, it's an accepted scientific phenomenon pretty much everywhere. Here's why you need one. It's accepted pretty much everywhere, but there's one place called the United States House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. This is true. Last week they held a hearing that they apparently recorded in 1971. I guess that's the technology part of the committee name. On President Obama's plan to shrink carbon emissions 30% by 2030. The hearing's Sisyphus, Presidential Science Advisor John Holdren, charged the impossible task of pushing 1 million pounds of idiot up a mountain. Of course, like any avalanche, it began rather innocuously. Texas Republican Steve Stockman.
Lead scientist at NASA said this. He
said that what ended the Ice Age was global wobbling. Is the wobbling of the Earth included in any of your modeling? And the answer was no. When you have a model and you say we're going to leave out the most important impact of that model out of our theory and not talk about global wobbling, how can you make projections?
What's up, scientists? Global wobbling, bitches! He sees your so-called global warming and raises you a global wobbling. Explain that, Dr. Whitehouse.
Global wobbling, which refers to changes in the Earth's tilt and orbit, takes place on characteristic timescales of 22,000 years, 44,000 years, and 100,000 years. It is very slow. Global wobbling is a tiny effect on the timescale of 100 years in which we try to run these models.
I didn't know we'd be talking to an actual scientist. All right, Holdren, you aced the wobble warming. Riddle me this.
At what point a level of CO2 does CO2 become damaging? At what level does it become harmful to human beings?
Boom! How can CO2 levels be dangerous when I can still breathe?
Vice Chairman Rohrabacher, I always enjoy my interactions with you.
Much in the way one enjoys playing peekaboo with a baby. Perhaps teasing a cat with a laser pointer.
I have to say with respect, that's a red herring. We are not interested in carbon dioxide concentrations because of their direct effect on human health. We're interested in them because their effect on the world's climate, and climate change has effects
it's a red
on human
herring.
health.
Well, then, why can we still breathe? That's what I'm asking. I mean, you can hear me, right? We're breathing. And it got more amazing as it went. Indiana's Larry Bouchon.
It's not about affecting the global temperature and climate change. There's public comments out there that question has been asked and answered saying no.
Now, you should look at the scientific literature rather than the public comments.
With all due respect, Representative Bouchon, I suggest you get the Journal of Applied Meteorology and Climatology as opposed to the YouTube comment feed of Obama Lies 1776. But here's where Bouchon gives away the game.
Have all the climatologists whose career depends on the climate changing to keep themselves publishing articles. Yes, I could read that, but I don't believe it.
I do not believe the scientists because it is their profession, not their hobby. Well, since we're talking about the influence money might have on climate change opinion, it turns out Representative Bouchon's three biggest campaign donors are Murray Energy, Koch Enterprises, and Peabody Energy. And trust me, those three well-funded companies would love to disprove climate change to the satisfaction of the scientific community at large. So if scientists could be bought, these would have already made it rain in Nerd Town. Trust me. And again, I cannot stress this enough. This is the House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology.
How long will it take for the sea level to rise 2 feet? I mean, think about it. If your ice cube melts in your glass, it doesn't overflow. It's displacement. I mean, this is some of the things that they're talking about mathematically and scientifically don't make sense.
Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I don't even know. I don't even know what to do with that. How far back to the elementary school core curriculum do we have to go to get someone on the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology caught up? Do we have to break out the paper mache and the baking soda so you can make a volcano? Is that what we have to do? Is that how basic the science class was when you went, I don't even know this anymore. I mean, for God's sakes, look. Here's a glass of ice water. Hey, that ice isn't making the water overflow because it's already in the water. But imagine there's a whole bunch of other ice that's not in the water. the land. You know, the part where the water isn't. And then when temperatures rise and the land ice melts enough to fall it everywhere. It's everywhere. Do you understand? Wait a minute. Global warming giant towels. Ultimately, the whole incredible and by all appearances willful misunderstanding of how the scientific method has been applied to climate change models and the effects of warming can be, pardon the pun, boiled down to this exchange.
That scare tactics like that, is really appalling to me, to use medical information to scare parents that their children about asthma attacks and scare people saying they're going to have heart attacks. I would argue that we should all, on both sides of this discussion, avoid scare tactics.
First of all, there aren't both sides to a discussion. What he's basically saying is it is unfair to talk to us about the scientific or medical consequences of our actions because they're scary. And we really don't feel like doing anything about it anyway. So from now on, why not agree that science and the oil industry both have opinions? Oh, and before you tell your kids to wash their hands after they take so they don't spread disease, maybe we should also spend an equal amount of time hearing from Big Fecal. We'll be right back.
Anyway, so sort of makes the point, right? It's the whole. All right, are you ready for the next one? Seem to all be here, as opposed to running away. Is it raining outside yet? I failed to look. Is it? All right. I'm gonna do my sound mark. If that's all right. So. Makes things easy to find. All right, so next one we have is ecology of disease. So these are slides mostly that my wife put together. And so I'm going to try and do my best at plowing through her materials. All right, so what is disease ecology, right? So what we're going to try and do is cover the ground that's telling us about temporal patterns, spatial patterns of where diseases are and why they're there, okay? And so that's what we're going to do, talk about what sorts of variables are important to give us the incidence, spatial distribution, and timing of diseases so that we can try and understand the whole system as opposed to, looking at just tiny components, each in isolation. All right, so the traditional medical approach is usually, again, a patient gets a disease, now I need to treat it, right? So that's not what we're gonna look at. What we're looking at is why do diseases occur where they occur? What is it that humans do that increase their probability of getting that disease in the first place? All right, so it's sort of this One Health idea, right, is looking at that. And have you talked about One Health in any other classes? Not really. So that's where you look at diseases in the environment, in domestic animals and wild animals and people living with all of those things. Okay, so that's kind of the notion. So for sure, disease ecology borrows things from epidemiology. So we'll refer to some things about that. Again, the notion is where do you find the highest levels of a particular disease agent and what can you do to reduce the likelihood of people contracting that disease in the first place. Okay. So again, epidemiology, which we'll talk about more tomorrow, is the study of incidence and distribution of things. Epidemics, right, is when you have this outbreak of a disease at some higher frequency than you would expect sort of normally, right? So it's super common for diseases to be episodic, for them to kind of come and go. But an epidemic is when, you know, the incidence becomes higher than sort of a normal occurrence, okay? Pandemics occur when that geographic distribution of an epidemic is large scale, right? And so there's, there may be dictionary definitions of these things, but I don't want to worry about exactly how large scale it is, as long as you get the general notion, right? Epidemic is a higher frequency than normal, and a pandemic is a larger geographic area than what you would typically expect. Okay, zoonoses are infections that can be transmitted from animals to humans, right? So they're things that we share, and typically we worry about the animals giving them to us, although there's a lot of work on diseases that we give to animals and then they come back to somebody else. So animals can become a vector. So there was a talk just a couple weeks ago in ecology from a group from NIH that's studying pigs, show pigs. So people who, you know, take hogs to these agricultural fairs and try and have the best pig, you know, at the state fair or some farm expo somewhere, right? So they they go from, oh, these pigs are on a farm, to now they're surrounded by tens of thousands of people and exposed to the diseases. Then flu is typically something they're most worried about. And then they take that flu virus back to the farm and spread it to other pigs. Okay, so goes in all directions or both directions. Disease vector, right, is usually, so it's any, I guess it's almost always an animal that is a recipient of a disease and moves it around from one host to another, right? Typically we're worried about mosquitoes, ticks, that's, you know, sand flies, things like that. But in the situation I was just describing, the pigs are a vector, right? And if a pig gets sick from one kid, it stays at the fair long enough that it gets sick and it starts sneezing and coughing and infects other people, right? Then that is, you know, more of a classic vector scenario. So vectors can come in all shapes and sizes. Arboviruses are viruses that are transmitted by arthropods. Okay, so ticks, insects, arthropods. Virulence is the ability of an infectious agent to damage the host, right? So it's not just, you know, can it propagate itself, but virulence is the idea that you get really, really sick. So the more virulent it is, the more sick you become. Super virulent things kill you, right? Okay, so again, a lot of times what people worry about is this, oh, there's a disease outbreak, what are we gonna do now? Oh no, right? What we need to have are systems in place to be ready to catch diseases when they occur. So this was very recently in the news, last week. Do you know what happened last week in the Trump administration? So there used to be in the National Security Council someone who dealt with epidemics. Okay, it was a rear admiral that had that position, and Bolton came in, rearranged the National Security Council, that guy's out. The next day, do you know what was in the news? The Ebola outbreak in Africa. Shocking, right? So now who's supposed to deal with that? Right? There's no obvious chain of command. There's not one person who's in charge of a response for infectious disease outbreaks, for pandemics. There used to be a single person that was in charge on the Security Council. So we'll see how that works out, right? Good luck to you, kids. All right. But what we really need to do is to manage diseases, right, at this larger scale, longer, time period, thinking of things more holistically. Again, the sort of One Health idea, right? The other thing that's really important, what it is that, rules ecology, is this notion that the goal of the biological game is to get your gametes, your genes, into the next generation, all right? That's how evolution works. So that's really sort of the driving thing, is that we're going to think about what are the scenarios that, organisms, what are their strategies they could have, versus what do you oftentimes see them with, right? And it's not that the organisms are thinking of the best strategy, it's what strategy leaves the most genes for the next generation. That's the successful one, okay? All right, so what are the big things that we need to worry about for infectious diseases? What are the things that are the most risk to us, all right? The first thing is, if a natural host for a disease is biochemically similar to us, then we have a higher probability that infectious agent can infect us and replicate and spread from person to person, right? So what group of organisms are most like us? Primates, right? So if you've ever known anybody who's gotten bitten by a monkey, I don't know, maybe I'm the only person who knows multiple people bitten by monkeys. If you happen to get bitten by a monkey, they're going to give you a goob gob of antibiotics, right? They're going to put you on a bunch of stuff. If you get bit in China, they're going to fly you back to the United States to get treatment, okay? Because monkeys are not only demonic, clever little things that get into your stuff, steal it, and bite you if you give them a chance, but they carry viruses and bacteria that are, readily infectious inside a person, okay? So, the things that, any disease agent must do, it has to infect us and grow, and then it has to be able to get out of one person and go to another. That's when, so this is a threat to you. This is a threat to the community, right? So if you can spread it from person to person, that's what we really worry about. Those are what's going to cause, epidemics and pandemics, okay? So many diseases that we have come from domestic animals and animals living close to us, of varying levels of domestication, right? All of these things are in blue, yes? I guarantee I'm going to ask you things from this list. So this is a really important slide to know. All right, so diseases from animals. Let's just see if you know a couple of these things. All right, do you know what we have received from cattle?
Mad cow disease.
Exactly, mad cow disease. Okay, what else?
English, that was a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and so do you know what kind of a disease agent that is that causes that? What class, what category? It's not a virus, it's not a bacteria. It's a prion. Heard of prions? So these are really weird, right? So it's a strange form, it's a shape of a protein that's naturally occurring, right? So it's not an infectious agent in most senses of the word, right? But if you get that structure, that protein structure, it will propagate and turn other proteins like it into that structure, which causes disease, right? So it's really weird, it's bizarre, right? So, and the way you get mad cow disease is eating cow brains, right? So you don't want to eat cow brains if they have mad cow disease, okay? Other ones more common, measles and tuberculosis, right? So these, we've all been treated for measles and tuberculosis, right? We've had those vaccinations. Used to be those diseases were super common. We still see epidemic outbreaks of measles and tuberculosis, right? And so measles, mumps, rubella, right? So the MMR, vaccination that you all have to have to go to public school in the United States, right? Because measles is super, super contagious.
You don't know you can get a religious exemption in certain hippie communities. Showing huge differences.
Right? So that whole thing of herd immunity, right? So we can give exceptions to a few people and it still won't, catch on like wildfire. But if you give out too many exceptions, then that whole thing breaks down. Pigs. We're just talking about one of the things, right? So influenza is the big thing, right? Various strains of influenza, because pigs have receptors to take influenza that naturally occurs in birds, right? And they have the receptors that are the same in us, and they can mix and match different kinds around. Horses, right? So that's common cold, come from horses. Rodents have all kinds of things, plague, Lyme disease, which we've talked about, hantavirus, four corners disease, right? So that's in them. Dogs, all kinds of stuff, right? Rabies, distemper, parvo. So again, you take your dogs in, you get them vaccinated so that they don't give you or your other pets these same diseases, right? So then there's all kinds of other stuff that we get, right, and share with domesticated animals. So in general, there are many, many diseases that either came from domestic or wild animals into us, or we gave to them, they changed around and gave it back to us, right? So there's this two-way exchange. And so, I mean, these are biggies, right? These aren't, just some, small things I never heard of.
So for this particular slide, do we just have to have a general understanding that animals give diseases?
That's the big picture, and then I'd like you to know an example or two from this slide, right? So I don't expect you to memorize the whole thing, but good to know a couple of those because they're pretty common. Yep.
So we can actually catch parvo too?
I don't know how much parvo gets into people. So for sure, yeah. So distemper and parvo are things that are super infectious in dogs and cats and raccoons, but I think you have to take a pretty big dose before it makes you sick, and I kind of don't know the details. If we had a vet med student, I would ask them to fill in the details because I don't know that. All right, so why don't zoonoses affect animals and humans the same way? Why can you get things that are super infectious, in one mammal and not every mammal, right? And the answer for that is that we have specific receptor proteins that are on the surface of our cells, and those aren't all shaped exactly the same, and they don't all have exactly the same functions once they get into a cell. So those differences among species afford us some level of protection, okay? But the more similar you are, for whatever receptor protein there is, that is problematic. And that's why you can see some things can jump from weird species to humans pretty readily, and then there's other things that don't, right? Because it's, involved with, we have a lot of receptor proteins, and it's a random chance of whether it's going to happen to hit ours or not, okay? So proteins are usually different in people. The surface proteins, right, which is the original target, that's what's trying to, it has to go past that gatekeeper first to get to the next level, right? So those can be specific. And so most viruses fail because they can't pass the first gatekeeper, right? So they don't get into the cells that they need to be able to replicate, okay? So if they can't do that, then you don't have to worry about anything else downstream. And that's part of why you see, a very rapid rate of evolution of surface cell proteins, is that it's typically good to be able to keep that moving, right? But occasionally those things, right, come back to a configuration where something will stick. Or you've got, so much mutation in other things that they'll have a variant that happens to work. Okay? And so that's when you get these emerging diseases like Ebola, Marburg, HIV, right, hantavirus. All of these things are circulating out in the wild, and if there happens to be a variant of it that happens to be able to hit, those surface cell proteins in a human and work well enough, then it gets a toehold in there, right? And once it gets a toehold, then it has the opportunity for evolution to happen where you get better and better as strains that can infect people. Does that make sense? Okay. So what are diseases that we've seen, right? In addition to the ones that were on the last slide, SARS was a big thing in East Asia. West Nile virus came through in the 90s, right? Was introduced from Africa into the Northeast United States and spread from birds, right? There were millions of birds that died from West Nile virus. Lyme disease, we've seen that's a homegrown one. It's been here for a long time, but it's moving around a lot. So this notion of a reservoir species, so that is a host in which the virus can exist or the bacteria can exist, but it doesn't make them sick, or it doesn't make them very sick. Okay, so they can still mostly function at a normal pace for a good while, okay? And so these are the dudes then that can spread things around. And so we thought SARS, right, was most likely coming through civets, okay? So why are these things increasing, right? So a variety of reasons of why you see more emerging diseases. It's because there's more interactions among species, right? We're sort of forcing species into smaller and smaller habitat space. People are coming into higher contact with them. There are more people on the planet to come into contact with them. There's more mixing around. There's more, moving of the animals out of wilderness habitats into markets, right? So all of those things are true. And so again, you have deforestation, which again is going to move stuff around. You have air pollution, so you have more stress, right? So even if you have a protected habitat, you have more stuff going on around them, causing more stress inside that habitat, more pollution inside the habitat, whether it's air pollution, noise pollution, whatever it is, right? Increased travel, increased urbanization, all of those things are contributing to this trend. We've shown this one already. This one gives you an idea of some of the different diseases that are out there and are relatively common, what's in them, what's the impact on human, what's the mechanism about them. Again, I'm not going to go through this huge slide. You don't need to read every word on the slide. This is something where you can go in and you say, oh, I'm particularly interested in Lyme disease. I wonder how, things play out for Lyme disease. So just know one example out of here. Don't try and memorize the whole thing. All right, evolution and ecology, right? So those two things go together. And so one thing where we know a lot about is malaria and the effect of malaria and the underlying mechanisms with things like sickle cell anemia. All right, so do you know the basic gist of sickle cell anemia? How it works, what the deal is? No? Nothing? No? Okay. Okay, so let me, I'm going to try and give you the background on these guys just a little bit, okay? So the basic gist is if you're normal, right, so your hemoglobin is normal, you have sort of the baseline level of protection from malaria, which is none, okay? If you are heterozygous for sickle cell, then you have some protection. So it's a variant of the hemoglobin protein. There's one specific nucleotide that changes, which changes one amino acid, and that changes the conformation of the hemoglobin. Linus Pauling discovered this in the 50s, right? Super smart guy, right? One of the smartest humans alive in the 20th century. Anyway, so he discovered that, and if you are homozygous for sickle cell, then that actually changes the structure from round to this shape for your red blood cells. Okay, when that happens, these can get stuck in your capillaries, and if you can imagine, if you have your blood cells stuck in your capillaries, that's bad. Okay, and so it used to be that most people that were homozygous for sickle cell would die before they got to reproductive age. So it was lethal, and that kept the frequency of sickle cell low, right? Because if you're homozygous for it, you're not going to reproduce. But the thing is, if you're heterozygous, then you have a higher fitness than somebody who's normal. So this is a classic example of balancing selection, and it occurs in humans. Okay, so because these people have the highest fitness, they can have the most babies, they're always going to be recreating some of these babies, and some of those. Right? So if you take, right, so if you do the whole Punnett square thing of these two versus two of these, or one of each, right? You can see how you're going to keep generating all three of those classes. Does that make sense? Okay. So sickle cell bad, malaria bad, right? And malaria is only spread by Anopheles mosquitoes, so it's one genus of mosquitoes with like 80 species, I think, something like that. All right, so there's multiple kinds of malaria, right? So this is one particular kind of malaria that's particularly bad, and it's related to the story that they have is that in these areas, these folks also grow yams, right? Sweet potatoes. And so the idea is that they have a yam festival every year, but they have a ban on eating yams before the festival. Okay, so while you're growing them, don't eat the yams. Okay, that ban occurs during the rainy season when you have the highest incidence of malaria. Okay, so the thing that's going on here, right, is, well, and you also have high sickle cell incidence where you have people who eat a lot of yams. And I go, why would you have yam eaters and then they can't eat yams when malaria is high? And so the thing about that is that yams contain thiocyanate, which reduces the effects of sickle cell. Okay, so it protects you from the effects of sickle cell, but it also reduces your resistance, therefore, to malaria. So during the rainy season, while malaria is most common, you don't want to be eating yams. But when it's dry and you're less likely to get malaria, then you want to be eating the yams to reduce the negative effects of sickle cell. Does that make sense? So it's one of these, again, these, folks didn't know thiocyanates, they didn't even know the malaria, right? These are traditions that have grown up in people because the people who followed this tradition had more babies than the people who did not. Does that make sense? Okay, so there wasn't, a knowledge of what was going on and setting up a cultural practice with that knowledge. Right? This is social evolution occurring, right, in the face of a really bad disease. Okay? And so again, these are just words that sort of say that. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So modern preventions against malaria includes things like bed nets, right? You can also take other drugs. There's increasing resistance to malaria treatment drugs, so things like chloroquine was one of the first widely used drugs against malaria, and now There's super common strains that are resistant to chloroquine, and I don't know if this is true, but I believe most, if not all, drugs that have been introduced to combat malaria, there are now resistant strains for, right? I mean, evolution happens, okay? So, a couple of questions, right? So, do all mosquitoes bite? No, only female mosquitoes bite. Do all females have equal probability of transmitting malaria? Do you know that one? So, no, right? So, they have to feed on a person or an animal that has malaria. So when they hatch, they don't have malaria in their guts. The females can't transmit it via eggs. So it's kind of like the same thing as Lyme disease. When they first hatch, they don't have it. The only way you get malaria as a mosquito is to feed on a person or an animal that has malaria, take that blood meal, the parasite then has to grow for about 10 days or more, and then you feed on somebody else again. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's how you get malaria, is that you have an old female who is infected that bites you again. Okay? So only females, older adult females, are the transmitters. Okay? So what can you do in an evolutionary sense? You want to skew the population to young females, right? If you can get rid of those old females, right, that would be a good thing. So one of the things that I've been telling people, I've been showing them this slide for years, is, you could imagine one way that you might treat malaria is that if you test people for malaria, you give them a drug to try and cure them, but you also give them something that if they get bit by a mosquito, will kill that mosquito within 10 days, right? Because if you can do that, no transmission. Does that make sense? And so I've been saying this for years, and it just came out. I don't think I put the slide in here. They've just finished a clinical trial doing that, right? Where they give people this drug that will kill mosquitoes, adult mosquitoes, after a couple of days. So again, I don't know that that's the first line of things that people are going to do, but it's one thing that you might imagine, right, as a way to break the cycle, and it works in the way that you want.
That tablet, isn't that something with a tablet that you put in water that they used to send travelers to developing nations? What it was supposed to do?
I can think of a couple different tablets that go in water. There's some that purify the water. I mean, so if you've got iodine tablets is the most common thing. So you can take sewer water, and if you put enough iodine in there, you're going to kill everything after a few minutes, then you can drink sewer water, just so you know. Right, and so you can eliminate that iodine unless you happen to be sensitive. It's for all kinds of things, yep. So that's the most common tablet that I'm aware of, that you can take like on camping trips and kill stuff. Yep. All right, so what are the major ways that these diseases are transferred? We worry the most in person-to-person contact, right? Those are the things that we know can cause human illness. Right, so coughing, sneezing, sexually transmitted diseases, touch, all of those are common ways. Fecal contamination is another super common way that things are transmitted. So cholera and typhoid, right, were all transmitted fecal-oral route. Inhalation, right, so that's how people get hantavirus. So there's mice that get into their house. The mice poop, and you go to clean up the mouse poop, and that creates a dust that you breathe in. You get that. Biting insects, which we've talked again, mosquitoes, fleas, ticks, all those kinds of things. All right, so this is the point of, remember, what we're trying to do is to stop these things from converting our body calories into them, right? And their goal is to convert us into them. Okay, so the most successful microbes, have virulence levels that maximizes reproduction, okay? So they don't necessarily have the maximum virulence. They have whatever level of virulence maximizes their reproduction. So depending on how they're transmitted, that impacts how virulent the most successful strains are. Okay, does that make sense? So we're going to go through a couple of examples of this. All right, so let's suppose that you have a virus that's transmitted by coughing or sneezing. Would you imagine that that thing tends to be on the more virulent or the less virulent end of the scale? Who says more virulent? Who says less virulent? Okay, very timid, few people. Yes, definitely on the less virulent, right? Because if you're going to cough and sneeze, you need to be able to move, right? So you're going to have more opportunities for exchange of that virus if you have more contact with more individuals, which means you got to be mobile, okay? What if something is transmitted by contaminated food or water, like cholera? Is that going to be on the more virulent or the less virulent end of the spectrum? More virulent, correct, right? Because if I'm laying there crapping out a bunch of viruses, I don't have to be mobile, right? If it's getting into the water system, that water system is the vector, okay? It's not me coughing and moving around, okay? So the more, viral particles I create in a short period of time, the better off that thing is, the more opportunities it has to be transmitted. Okay, so what about a biting insect? On the more virulent or the less virulent end of the spectrum? Think about things like malaria, dengue, breakbone fever, right? Zika, right? So those tend to be on the more, right? Because again, you can lay there and be as sick as you want, and being sick actually means you're more likely to be bit by other, bugs, and you're not going to brush them off and make them get off your body, right? So they're more likely to bite you, and then they can transmit more, the more debilitated they can make you, okay? So, right, so sometimes we see host and pathogens evolve together. That's not uncommon, right? And so that you're seeing an arms race, right, between the host and the pathogen, and they're trying to, each beat each other, and oftentimes you see them, marching along where they're both still getting, the host is still getting infected, but it's at least not sick, right, or it's at least not dying, right? Hospital strains, also called nosocomial infections, right? Those tend to be much more resistant on average, right? Because only really sick people go to the hospital. If you're not really sick, you don't go. And they tend to be more virulent because they have vectors in the form of hospital workers that will move them around from one person to another, right? That's why you have these whole departments of infection control at hospitals that try and enforce things like hand washing between rooms, right? So that's the whole, when a doctor comes into the room, there's a sink there, and you should watch them wash their hands in that sink before they touch you, right? Because you don't know who they saw in the last room. So nosocomial infections are more common than we would like, and they cause more deaths than we would really like. So there's still, this might be something you might think, oh no, we have rubber gloves, people know to wash their hands, right? So this is a constant battle that I would say, we're still working really hard on. Infants in NICUs are particularly susceptible. You know, they're tiny, they have poorly developed immune systems, so it's super easy for them to get an infection. So large percentage of them do get infections. All right, so what are some common big disease events that you might want to know a little bit about? Spanish flu, right, which transmitted during World War I, was a big thing. All right, so what killed more people, right? The war to end all wars or Spanish flu? You have a feel for that? Have any of you learned about World War I? Yeah, so it's like twice as many people died of Spanish flu in the course of just a little over a year than died in the killing fields of Europe, right? And I mean, how many books have been written about the killing fields of Europe, right? So it's pretty bad, right? Transmitted very easily during trench warfare, transmitted very easily when they had the recruiting stations and training soldiers, even in the US. Huge numbers of people, right? Huge numbers of people were sick. They, converted armories where they should have been training soldiers into hospitals, for people who had the flu, a large percentage of which died. So when you're talking about flus, oftentimes they'll talk about the strains like an H and then a number and then the N and a number. So those have to do with two particular proteins that are on the surface of the viral particle. Those aren't necessarily the most important surface proteins. They are important, but the main reason that we look at those and number things is that we had an assay that you could do, in a petri dish 100 years ago and characterize strains of bacteria. And 50 years ago, we could get even better, right? So the naming of them and, what's the most important isn't necessarily totally matched up, but it's, these are the things that you'll oftentimes hear about. Okay, so why are we worried about the flu? Why do we continue to worry about it? Because flu is a natural intestinal virus that occurs in wild birds. Wild birds travel around the world, right? So they move these viruses all around. There are billions of birds in the world. So that means they're creating and shedding these viruses into the environment in large numbers and moving, within continents and among continents. Okay? And so we worry also a good bit about these, going from wild birds into domestic birds, right? So if they get into chickens and ducks and geese, turkeys, right? You may see a government destroy all of the chickens or turkeys or ducks within, 2 square miles of wherever they had a diseased individual, right? And when you're talking about chickens, that can be 500,000 chickens at a whack, right? So it's large numbers of individuals. So these things can be highly contagious among birds. The ones that we've been worrying about lately have had pretty low transmissibility between birds and humans, but occasionally you would see, an infected duck, infect 3 or 4 family members. Person to person is really, really rare, and that's when that's occurred, it's typically been within a family, so it's from one family member to another family member, and not outside of the families. And this is maybe, I checked on this spring. The latest numbers they had since 2003 were 650 cases in 15 countries. Now it could be the data that's on the CDC website is still old. I won't make any claims about how old that is, but it was current as of this spring. So as of 2015, right, we haven't had that many, right? So there's still some coming in from Asia and the Middle East. but we haven't had any directly coming into humans in the US. But why do we worry about it? Because the few humans who do get it, more than half of them die, right? So that's pretty bad, right? And so what we really worry about is if we start seeing this thing get into humans and then it makes that leap from being able to transmit from human to human, and you've got 50% of the people dying, all right, that would be pretty bad. Okay, so again, we've worried a good bit about that. Those two molecules are only part of the diversity and part of what's driving the story. So again, virulent strains, what we worry most about is if they can move from person to person. And that's what made the 1918 flu really bad, is that it came in, it had high mortality rates, and it was super infectious, being able to, infect, go from person to person. That's when you see millions of people dying. Okay, so what are the management decisions, right? So oftentimes you'll see people wearing face masks, right, as a primary guard against transmission. You'll also see, like I said, going in and they'll clear out farms entirely when they have these avian viruses that they're worried about. Global travel is a big deal, right? So do you remember SARS? Do you remember that at all? You're all like, no. So it was a while ago. Trying to think if they've had anything else. There was an avian influenza outbreak. There's also one, camel. What's the camel? The virus that's in the camels. Just in the last year or two, that's been coming out. And so they monitor people in the airports. Do you know how they do that? They look at your temperature, right? So they have video cameras set up, so IR cameras that measure the temperature on your face. When SARS first came out, they were, making everybody take their temperature with a probe, right up to your head as you came off the airplane. So it didn't have to touch you. And now they just have video cameras in place, IR cameras. So they just do. So now people aren't so worried, but they do the same thing. So right? So, but I mean, it's good, right? It's good that they're, right? So they can detect, because your temperature is going to spike before you come down with other symptoms. That's the first thing that's going to happen. And it's typically either right as you're becoming infectious or slightly before. So that it's a pretty good model. So anyway, and all the big airports now, especially if you're coming back from Asia, everybody, you're in a line as you come off, and they just monitor the video as people are coming off. So, right. Humans travel a lot more than we used to, and we ship stuff everywhere, and this gives us the opportunity to move things around, right? So the plague was one of the first examples of an innovation in human travel, spreading a disease rapidly, horseback. People weren't able to do that several hundred years prior to that. Horses became common, and you started to see diseases moving around more rapidly than before. And so again, this is sort of the idea. It took only a couple of years for things, from 1347 to 1349, for things to move, hundreds and hundreds of miles. Whereas before, that just wouldn't have been true when there wasn't global trade and relatively rapid movement of people. Yellow fever, I'm not going to worry too much about that. This is another infectious disease. Again, it's something, if you've traveled, you have to get vaccinations for yellow fever, depending on the country that you're going to. Durability and virulence. Okay. The durability is the ability for a pathogen to survive in the environment outside its host. Okay? So the longer something can live outside its host, it tends to be more virulent, right? And so the poster child for that is smallpox, right? So smallpox is super virulent. It turns you into a pustule and then you die. right? But it can live in blankets and things for years on end, right? And so this was the first agent of biological warfare used by the British and American soldiers, or pre-American soldiers, right, during the French and Indian War in the United States, right? So, and still probably used by some of the American troops later against Native Americans, right? That's how we depopulated the Americas, right? So millions of people died. Okay, so smallpox is viable for decades in the environment. That's why we worried about it for a long time, right? I don't know, do any of you have vaccinations? I think I'm probably among the very last group, right? So if you, right? So you want to know how old somebody is, right? So if they're 50 or older, right, as of right now, that's the, look for that smallpox vaccine. So other things like tuberculosis can be viable in the wild for outside of a body for up to weeks, right? It's also viable in many different mammalian hosts. That's why we're likely to never get rid of tuberculosis. You can cure it from every person on Earth. It doesn't matter. It can survive in many hosts. Things like smallpox, it's one of 2 viruses that humans have been able to get rid of. This is the only human virus that we've gotten rid of. Rinderpest is the other virus that hits ungulates. That's the other virus that we've been able to eliminate from the earth. So other things, right? Things like common colds and flu viruses, right? Those are only viable for a few hours, right? That's why if you have your cleaning crew, cleaning up door handles at night, every night, that can make an impact on, the ability to transmit flu, right? Or if you have them go through a couple times during the day, that can make a significant impact.
Does smallpox still contain in Atlanta this disease control?
I believe that's true. They definitely have had it in the past. Yep. And they, so there was only supposed to be 2 labs that had it, right? So CDC in Atlanta and a place in Russia. And then they discovered it in a closet in an NIH lab somewhere, New York somewhere maybe. Right? So, so it's one of those whoops. All right, and then when was it? Last year there was somebody at CDC shipped some super virulent agent out by mistake, right? So then they had to go through all their freezers tube by tube, right? So you had these, senior scientists who make, $180,000 a year doing freezer inventory for 2 months, right? Which seems a little extreme, but right, if you want to know what every tube is, I collected that in New Guinea in, 1962. Right, so that's the only way you know. Anyway, so this gets at that idea of you can have really big population effects when you have new viruses that come through. So this is the Native American population, in 1500 when Europeans started coming here. It was, and actually I think this is just Aztecs, so in Central America and Central Mexico, right? So 20 million plus people, in comes smallpox, you lose a third of your population, right? In comes the next thing, right? So I mean, they just devastated the natives by bringing in these new diseases they, weren't resistant to. So this is why we worry, right? Is having things like this move through a population would be, bad. Be not good. So what do we do, right? So we need clean water, proper sewage disposal, mosquito proofing, right? So when you see water tanks, they're covered with a net or some other thing. We need basic hygiene, right? So that's sort of the first level of public health and is really, the ground level for environmental health is basic sanitation, right? So environmental health used to be, the sanitation division. It's how do we deal with garbage? How do we deal with sewer, right? How do we get clean water to people? If you can do those three things, those bring down disease incidence in huge amounts, right? And in places in the world where we've dealt with those, you see that.
In Athens, I think you can go get tablets to put in the swimming pools or something.
Yep.
At the
Yep.
department for your swimming pool and such. And then don't they spray sometimes?
Yep.
Like they do helicopter.
Absolutely. So mosquito control is still common in the U.S. They mostly do it at night. So I don't know if any of you have ever noticed the mosquito sprayers coming by your house at night.
I just heard they were in there.
Oh yeah. So have you ever had to sleep someplace that doesn't have air conditioning? Okay, so therein lies the fundamental problem, right? So if you go someplace where you're forced to not have air conditioning in August and sleep there for a while, you'll hear the mosquito trucks come through. They go, wee, right? And they're spraying mosquitoes, right? So all big cities in the South, many small cities, towns, just so you know, there's whole folks of people their whole job, or at least during the summer, is to slaughter mosquitoes. Okay, so this is so places where you've had cases of diseases that are waterborne, and again, you know, it's hundreds of thousands of people that can be infected with waterborne diseases. Right, and so these aren't super uncommon. Okay, one of the places, one of the diseases that we worry about the most is cholera, right? And so you know the Jon Snow pump for the handle. I'm seeing one person go yes, and everybody else is like crickets. Okay, so right, so the father epidemiology, right? How did he discover, right? So there was cholera outbreak, and he traced the outbreak to one particular public well, where people, you know, is back in the day when they're pumping the well. And so he decided to, you know, intervene, and he chained the pump handle down so they couldn't pump water out of there anymore. And the cholera outbreak went away. All right, so that's the trace, so that's the whole source tracking thing, right? So cholera has been around and infecting people for a long time. It's transmitted by water. The most common way for people to get it is from bivalves in fish. And so you can still get this today. There's a couple of different kinds. In the United States, if you eat raw oysters, so one of the main reasons to not eat raw oysters is if the Vibrio is in there. It can also give you, if you've got a cut on your leg and it gets infected, it's one of those flesh-eating bacteria, right? So you can amputate your leg, or it can kill you. You can also transmit it from person to person. It does grow in fresh water. And in particular, the thing is that if you get fecal contamination in a water source, then that's how you get that person-to-person transmission. Because when you get cholera, you're pooping uncontrollably, right? You have, you know, explosive diarrhea. Okay, so cholera has been around again for a long time. We're currently in the 7th pandemic of cholera. And it is coastally, it's abundant in coastal waters, right? We can't really, you're not going to get rid of it. It's in the ocean, so it's never really going to go away, but you can reduce the amount that gets into people, okay?
In the United States?
Including people in the United States. It's a very low incidence level in the United States, mostly from people who are traveling. Right, it's really, really rare for somebody to contract cholera inside the U.S. other than from things like raw oysters or getting a skin infection, right? And those are like dozens of cases per year. It's not like thousands of people. There's lots of serotypes There's one particular one that people worry about now. Don't worry too much about that. The big thing is these make a toxin, and it's that toxin that makes you super, super sick. And so again, you get profuse diarrhea. And so literally what they do is they put you on a table with a hole cut out underneath your butt, because you're not gonna stop the things coming out of you, okay? So the way that people die from this is they have severe dehydration. So you need to get them water and oftentimes an IV so that you're replacing body fluids in them quick enough that they don't die, okay? So there's sort of a system in place for the ecology. In the Caribbean, it's relatively well studied because there have been a couple of flare-ups there. It's close to the United States. We've worried a lot about it. And so there are things like the African dust that blows off the Sahara, blows across the Atlantic Ocean and settles in the Caribbean. That dust is orange, right? If you've seen pictures of the Sahara, it's kind of an orangey color. That carries iron, which increases the incidence of these Vibrio. So you'll see blooms of Vibrio that follow a dust storm. And then you'll see that increasing on the copepods and other microcrustaceans that carry these things in their shells. And then that increases the likelihood that people get it. Again, this is, I wouldn't say it's a totally nailed down story, but there are multiple people who have been testing this hypothesis, including Aaron Lipp in our department here at UGA. Forget about that. So, it's also true that Vibrio is a much bigger deal in the summer when the water is hot, right? That's why if you're going to eat raw oysters, you do it during the winter, or you get them from places like Maine, where the water is cold. Okay, and again, this is just kind of showing it's more common in places where it's warm. The other thing to know is that Vibrio tends to be pretty common in these little calanoid copepods, so little tiny guys, sort of the size of fruit flies, that live in the water, and they live on sediments. And so these are super abundant organisms in marine environments and estuaries. I don't know any of that. So the bacteria are flagellated, right? So they can move around. And again, they live inside these copepods. So how do you get rid of the bacteria? How do you, protect yourself? A big thing that people do is they boil their water, right? So that will kill the bacteria. That's probably associated with, why do you see drinking tea as a common practice that the British, whenever they went around the world, they, spread that tradition. If you boil your water, you get rid of typhoid, cholera, right? There's multiple things that you can kill from boiling your water, okay? Other things you can do is to reduce the probability of getting those copepods in your water, okay? So these are tiny, right? These are microns. These are millimeters big, okay? So these are much, much bigger than those dudes, right? Those are single cells, tiny bacterial cells. These are multi-celled animals, okay? So one of the things that they've tried to do to reduce cholera in places like Bangladesh and India, where they don't have a tradition of boiling their water before they use it, is to do things like covering the top and straining the water with cloth. And so they use a sari cloth. And again, you're not going to stop the bacteria from getting through the cloth no matter how many times you fold it. But if you fold the cloth enough times, you'll keep out the copepods, okay? So the individual bacteria floating around, which there's not very many in the water column, those will still get through. But the big numbers, the big clumps of bacteria that are more likely to be infectious to you, and cause you to get sick, those you can strain out because they're stuck to pieces of poo or a copepod or something else.
Why don't they boil them?
They don't have easy access. They'd have to, yeah, they don't have stoves, right? So if you don't have easy access to heat, it makes it tough, right? So again, what they do is, you know, reducing just by straining out using a cloth to get the particles out of there, that cuts the incidence, you know, significantly. Okay. Another thing you can do is to reduce the fish that you might eat that are big eaters of copepods. All right, so you can just shift your fishing practices. All right, so now I think this might be the last big nugget. STDs, right? Okay, so what's weird about STDs? Most of them, well, you tell me. Would you say most STDs are on the high end of virulence or the low end of virulence? Low end, right? Because I mean, you can have STDs for a long time. Many people don't have any symptoms whatsoever. That's why they can transmit them to many partners, right? Before they know they even have them.
Well, with a cold, just like you could spread a cold by kissing, would that be an STD?
Nope. Usually it takes sexual intercourse is usually the hallmark. Okay, so typically, right, these pathogens have to be in your body, right, for a long period of time. And so that's another thing that comes in with STDs is that most people aren't changing partners on a super rapid basis, right? So that means it's in you for a long time, not causing symptoms, so that it has a higher probability of moving to multiple individuals, right? So the longer it can stay in you and incubate and not cause you problems, the more partners you're likely to encounter and infect. Does that make sense? Okay, so what are some of the solutions, right? So syphilis removes the proteins on their outer coat. It makes it harder for your immune system to recognize them. HIV actually infects your immune cells, right? So that's the problem that HIV causes, all right? HIV is really a wimpy virus, right? I mean, you have to work pretty hard. You have to put it into tissues that are meant to suck up water, right? So that's why you can't, you know, it takes like gallons of spit to transmit HIV, right? But usually humans are transmitting something else into other orifices that aren't meant to have fluids put in them. So that's the most efficient way, right? So it's a wimpy virus, and it gives you, you get sick after a week or 3, and then you get better, right? Everybody gets better. And then it incubates for years on end, and then it starts attacking those immune cells. And so it's a breakdown of the immune cells to be able to do their function that actually is why HIV ends up killing people, okay? Gonorrhea, again, changes proteins on their outer coat. Herpes hides in neurons, right? So those are cells that are really long-lived, right? So, and the immune system isn't going to be surveying your neurons because you're not going to be replacing them very often. So if something attacks your neurons, you're going to have it for the rest of your life, right? And that's why things like herpes, you don't get rid of them, okay? Human papillomavirus, again, it hides inside cells and then divides with them. Okay? So, again, the virulence of a strain is dependent on the likelihood of changing partners. So that's not the biology of the people, right? So it's the sociology, it's the behaviors of the society that the people, are in. Okay, so you can change the virulence just based on the behavior of the people, the group of people that the virus is in. So what's the, most optimal strategy can change, okay? So condom use, frequent partner change, all of those can change, you know, what level of virulence is the most successful, okay? So again, it's not that the pathogens are trying to go in some certain direction. It's that there's a range of virulence that's available, and whichever part of the range is most successful in a particular scenario, that's what you see becoming the most common. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Again, and this is sort of the same idea as we had for antibiotic resistance. It's the same idea for virulence, right? Is that there's a range before selection and after selection, then it's there, right? And so it moves to whatever is optimal, whatever produces the most offspring. Okay, and again, you'll see things like HIV virulence will vary among human populations. Now again, because humans move a lot, you're going to see every strain everywhere, but the frequency of different strains varies depending on the social systems in place. Okay, same sort of a thing is that, you know, you've seen South Africa get hit particularly hard, and that's a place, it's a social system where you see a lot of partner change, right? So that's a system in which you would expect higher virulence strains to do better, right? And it's not that you can't find the high virulence strains everywhere, they do occur everywhere. Okay, chronic infections, right? So there's all kinds of chronic infections. Those are other issues. I'm not going to go into these in super great detail. Again, they're common, but that is, you know, one of the biggest public health things that we worry about. That's where most of our healthcare dollars goes, is in treating chronic diseases. Okay, we know a relatively small number of cancers are caused by pathogens, right? So you know that infectious things, infections can cause cancers. So HPV is the one that's been in the news the most, right? But there's other cancers that are caused by viruses. There are probably more than that that are known, that are, you know, have some contributing factor. So it's sort of like when we talked about potentiation. So if you have the virus, that doesn't cause cancer, but if you have the virus plus something else, then you get cancer, right? And so those more complicated scenarios, there's probably a lot of them that are waiting, you know, to be discovered. What is this? So less than 5% of all cancers are known to be caused without any influence, right? Which is to say, right, there's a big field of things that could be influenced, even if they don't cause it directly. Okay. And so this is the idea of inflammation, right? So inflammation is a general condition associated with many chronic diseases, and though that's a huge contributing factor to many things, right? So again, a lot of the studies that we have now are association studies, and so association gives you, you know, some likelihood that those two things are causatively correlated. But that's, you know, that's step one. And then typically what you need to do is do a clinical trial, do animal studies that really show those proof of what's going on. I'm going to kind of skip over these other things if that's all right. Breast cancer, right? So there's been a lot of things in the news about, you know, do your genetic testing for BRCA1, right? And, you know, should you get a proactive mastectomy based on, you know, what allele of BRCA1 you have? There are a few alleles that are associated with a very high probability of breast cancer, but those are relatively rare, okay? And so genetic factors are one part of the puzzle, but it's not the whole thing, right? Even in the ones that have a high association, it's still not a one-to-one probability. It's relatively far from that, right? So again, viruses can contribute to this effort, right? So viruses are part of the picture. Other things like atherosclerosis, where you're getting these fat buildups inside your arteries. Again, men are pretty susceptible. These can, these plaques lead to heart attacks and strokes. And so I wanted to give you an idea. Oftentimes you see this thing where, oh, there's a restriction, and I wanted to show you something. So this is a little bit graphic. So if you're not into graphic stuff, so this is the idea of your carotid arteries on both sides of your neck, right, leading to blood flow to your brain. So these will develop plaques, and over time, those get to be really restricted. And so this is the size of what they yank out when somebody's got, right, serious blockage. So this is a piece that actually goes physically onto that end of it. Okay, so right? So that's what you're eating and getting into your veins and arteries. That's why they tell you to reduce your bad cholesterol. They put you on medication, right, to reduce that. So what are the top 10 causes, right? Heart disease, cancer, right? Then everything else in much smaller amount. So stroke, everything else smaller. We know what are the risk factors for that: smoking, high-fat diet, high cholesterol, blah, blah, blah. But we also know, there's a few genetic markers and markers of inflammation. All of those things are in there together. Those are common risk factors. If you go see your doctor, they'll tell you to put it in there or to take care of those things. But there's some evidence that certain bacteria will also make it worse. Okay, and again, this is sort of one of those things. I'm not telling you this is, absolutely the deal, but there's evidence about this that might turn out to be important, right? And so there's sort of, again, evidence in all of these categories how this one particular bacteria, is a contributing factor to any of those things that your doctor is typically telling you about. Okay, so there's lots of potential ways in which these things can impact us. Are we going to figure out that these things are, potentiating disease? Maybe so. I think these are opportunities that you're likely to see. Okay, so is a disease correlated with an environmental factor? What factors increase or decrease the incidence? And can we change those factors? That's really the nugget of what we were trying to get at.
Can people get tested for it then to see if maybe it's in their system and
Yep.
have it treated?
Yep. Well, and I don't know the resistance of that to common antibiotics. So that's a good question. All right. Do you have questions about this? No, tons of stuff. All right. So again, hopefully you learned a few nuggets that were new to you. Sure. Why not? Absolutely.